want to talk about godly character in a corrupt culture. Godly character in a corrupt culture. I'm going to kind of fly through 3 chapters of 1 Samuel. We'll kind of slow down in chapter 3, but I want to give you a little overview in the first 2 chapters of what was going on in Israel at this time. It says in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 1, now there was a certain man of Ephraim, and I'll just skip all the other stuff, and his name was Elkanah. And verse 2, he had 2 wives. The name of one was Hannah. The name of the other was Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah had no children. In those days, barrenness was considered a curse from the Lord. If you had no children, you were considered lowly in society. You weren't loved in this culture. Elkanah had 2 wives, and immediately one would wonder, does God condone such behavior? And let me just be clear in a brief comment on this subject that no, God does not condone polygamy. Just because something is recorded in the Bible does not mean God condones it. We have the words of Satan recorded in the Bible. God certainly does not condone Satan's words. And so we need to recognize that we're just seeing the facts. And the fact that's being painted here for us is that Samuel was birthed by compromised parents. His parents were compromised in their walk in the Lord. And in fact, this book, 1 Samuel, is written on the tail of the Judges. It's at the end of the period of the Judges, heading into the period of the prophets. And we know by looking through the book of Judges that not only were Samuel's parents compromised, but all of society was compromised. The book of Judges ends with a statement, every man did what was right in his own eyes. And so society was compromised. Samuel's parents were compromised. And verse 3, Elkanah, Samuel's dad, went up from his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. Shiloh was the religious center of Israel at this time. They weren't in Jerusalem yet. Also, the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priests of the Lord, were there. Why are we being told about Hophni and Phinehas here? We'll discover shortly that these 2 men were scoundrels. They were just bad guys. The devil was in the house of the Lord. The church was compromised, if you would. And it was not a great time to go worship the Lord in Shiloh. If people went to Shiloh to worship the Lord, they did so despite the experience they were going to have, not because of the experience they were going to have. The saddest thing that can exist in a society is when the church is the least safe place that a person can go. And that was the case in those days. And verse 4, whenever the time came for Elkanah to make an offering, he would give portions to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and daughters. But to Hannah he would give a double portion, for he loved Hannah, although the Lord had closed her womb. So now we have the backstory of Samuel's birth. We have a man in Israel with 2 wives, and he loved one wife more than the other. He favored one wife over the other. The one had children, but the one he really loved was barren, and yet he took special care of her, even though she was not able to provide him with children. Now, if we jump to verse 9, it says, Hannah arose after they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the tabernacle, and she was in bitterness of soul and prayed to the Lord and wept in anguish. Then, verse 11, she made a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if you'll indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a male child, then I will give him to the Lord. all the days of his life, and no razor shall come upon his head. So she made a vow to keep him as a Nazirite, much as Samson's mother did the same with Samson, vowed to keep him consecrated to the Lord. Maybe that's why the Lord withheld a child from Hannah. Maybe that's why he never answered her prayer in the first place for children, was because she asked amiss. Maybe she had the wrong motives in wanting a child up until this point, and she finally came to the point where her motive for having a child was not to teach Peninnah a lesson, but her motive for having a child was to glorify the Lord. And so the Lord then was able to answer her prayer and give her that child. The rest of the chapter describes the Eli thinking she was drunk and accusing her of drunkenness in the temple, and then she lets him know that she's just bitter of heart and sad, and he prophesies she's going to have a child, and she does. She has little baby Samuel. And then in chapter 2, Hannah starts the chapter by singing the song of Hannah. Hannah prayed and said, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is exalted in the Lord. I smile at my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation." Mary probably got her song, the Magnificat, from Hannah's prayer because it's very similar in character and in the verbiage, and that she probably learned it from Hannah's prayer when she had her baby. Then it says, she goes on to say, "No one is holy like the Lord." Verse 2, "For there is none besides you, nor is there any rock like our God. Talk no more so very proudly. Let no arrogance come from your mouth. For the Lord is the God of knowledge." And get this last phrase, "and by him actions are weighed." This is a very important truth to understand, that God weighs our actions. It's important to understand that it doesn't say God judges our actions. God weighs our actions, and that's very different. In other words, doing the right thing is not necessarily enough. If God judged our actions, then doing the right thing would be fine, no matter what your motive. But God weighs our actions. You can do the right thing and still be condemned because you do it with the wrong heart or in the wrong way. Have you ever found yourself being right and yet being in trouble because you handled being right in the wrong way? You married men can relate. Right? Because even though you're right, because of the way you handle it, you have to go back and apologize, because you handle it wrongly. Well, that's how God looks at it. He doesn't look so much at what we do. He considers the motive behind what we do. If the motive of what we do is to love the Lord and to be a blessing to Him, then we'll almost always do it right. Paul said that, talks about the day in Romans 2:15 when men's thoughts would be accusing or either excusing them, in the day when God will judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ, according to my gospel. God will judge not your actions, but the things that were going on in your heart when you did them. Jesus said in Matthew 6, "Take heed that you do not do your charitable deeds before men to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven." See, God doesn't just look at your charitable deed, He looks at the motive behind our charitable deed. He looks at our heart and weighs our motive in what we do and do not do. And so, if you do what you do out of love for Him, you'll never go wrong. Jump to verse 12. It says, and here we get a glimpse of the wickedness of Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. It says, "Now the sons of Eli were corrupt. They did not know the Lord." That word corrupt literally means they were sons of Belial, or sons of the devil is another way to translate that. They were, the devil was in God's house. And the priest's custom, verse 13, with the people was that when any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged flesh hook in his hand while the meat was boiling. Then he would thrust it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot, and the priest would take for himself all that the flesh hook brought up. So they did in Shiloh to all the Israelites who came there. So here's what they would do. They would come to the boiling pot of meat that was being seethed to offer a sacrifice to the Lord. And they were supposed to get a portion of the meat. That was God's decree. But the way they did it was they said, well, we'll just take what we want. So they took a 3-pronged fork and shoved it in the pot. And whatever they came out with, it was kind of like, they bobbing for apples. They come out, woo, I got a prize today. And they take the best meat that way. And it was just kind of sad. Not only that, but the chapter goes on to tell us that they would actually take some of the meat before it was boiled and before the fat was trimmed off of it, which belonged to the Lord. And the people that complained would get beat up. They would take it raw so that they could grill steaks instead of having it boiled. And not only that, but it says that they were molesting the women that came to worship the Lord. When women came that they were attracted to, they would go and take advantage of them and abuse them. So it was a horrible time to worship the Lord with these two men there in the temple. Jump to verse 23. When they were confronted, so Eli said to them, "Why do you do such things? For I hear of your evil dealings from all the people. No, my sons, for it is not a good report that I hear. You make the Lord's people transgress. If one man sins against another, God will judge him. But if a man sins against the Lord, we'll intercede for him." Nevertheless, they did not heed the voice of their father, because the Lord desired to kill them. How do you handle confrontation when you do something wrong? When someone confronts you because you were out of line, how do you deal with it? Do you accept it? Do you excuse it? Do you ignore it? This is an important question to ask. These men were beyond the point of conviction over the sin. When they were confronted, they just ignored their dad. They said, "Whatever, Dad, you don't know what you're talking about." And this is sadly what a lot of young people do today. A lot of young people take this attitude that their parents are idiots. And when they're confronted for wrongdoing, they just go, "Whatever," and they don't want to listen. But that's what these boys were doing, and that was God's judgment on them for the wickedness of their hearts. He was planning to wipe them out. In the rest of the chapter, God prophesied about how he was about to wipe these boys out, and Eli as well. Jump to verse 34. It says, "Now this shall be a sign to you that will come upon your 2 sons, on Hophni and Phinehas. In one day they shall die, both of them. Then I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall walk before my anointed forever." This is the prophecy of the new priesthood God would raise up, a priesthood according to the order of Melchizedek, and his high priest would be the Lord Jesus Christ. In the short-term prophecy here, this was the promise of Samuel, a man who would be faithful to the heart and the mind of God. In other words, he would have such a relationship with the Lord that he would do what the Lord was thinking. Does that make sense? That's an interesting relationship. Do you do what other people think? Only if you know them really well. If you know how they think. If you know what they think about. My wife, I know her. And so I can do what she's thinking. In fact, most of the time I have to do what she's thinking because she doesn't tell me until I'm in trouble. And then, so I just have to read her mind. And I just say that because most of you husbands have that problem. My wife doesn't do that. Jump over to chapter 3. Now the boy Samuel ministered to the Lord before Eli, and the word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no widespread revelation. It's tragic when God has nothing to say to man. And that was going on in these days. Nobody was hearing from God. And it came to pass at that time when Eli was lying down in his place, and when his eyes had begun to grow so dim that he couldn't see, and before the lamp of God went out, in the tabernacle of the Lord, where the ark of God was, and while Samuel was lying down, that the Lord called Samuel, and he said, "Here I am." So he ran to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." And he said, "I didn't call. Lie down again." And he went and lay down. And the Lord called yet again, "Samuel." So Samuel rose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you called me." And he answered, "I didn't call, my son. Lie down again." Now Samuel didn't yet know the Lord, nor was the word of the Lord yet revealed to him. That's an interesting word, know the Lord, right? We use that question. And in fact, I heard some of you, when you went out witnessing, ask people, "Do you know Jesus?" But what does that mean, to know him, to know the Lord? You know, it doesn't mean the same thing in society as it means to God's people. When you ask someone that, when you're witnessing, normally you're not going to get the answer you were expecting, because the answer you're probably going to get is, "Yeah, I know him," even if they do not have a relationship with him. But you can't know someone unless you have a relationship with them. Knowing someone implies having a relationship. And so, rather than ask people, "Do you know Jesus?" a better question is, "Can I talk to you about Jesus?" And then, let them tell you where they're at in their relationship with the Lord. But don't ask them if they know Jesus, because if you do, you're not going to get the right answer, because they're not going to define know in the same way that you do. So just ask them, "Hey, would you mind if I talk to you about Jesus for a minute?" And then go from there. And the third time, verse 8, the Lord called Samuel again the third time. So he rose and went to Eli and said, "Here I am, for you did call me." Then Eli perceived that the Lord had called the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, "Come lie down. And it shall be, if he calls you, that you must say, 'Speak, Lord, speak, Jehovah, for your servant hears.'" So Samuel went and lay down in his place. Now the Lord came and stood and called out as at other times, "Samuel, Samuel!" And Samuel answered, "Speak, for your servant hears." Now at this point I can assure you, Samuel was wide awake. Right? Then the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I will do something in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli all that I've spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I've told him that I'll judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile and he didn't restrain them. See, bad parenting will get you judged. And therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever." The family of Eli had passed the point of no return. They had gotten to a place where nothing would sway God from bringing the judgment that he intended to bring upon that household. So Samuel, verse 15, lay down until morning, and I'm sure he didn't sleep, and opened the doors of the house of the Lord, and Samuel was afraid to tell Eli the vision. And Eli called Samuel and said, "Samuel, my son." He answered, "Here I am." And he said, "What's the word that the Lord spoke to you?" Ouch, right? "Please do not hide it from me. God do so to you and more also, if you hide anything from me of all the things that he said to you." So Samuel had that horrified look on his face. What did the Lord say to you? Had to be terrified to tell him what the Lord told him. And so Eli warned him that he needed to tell him everything. Then Samuel told him everything and hid nothing from him. And he said, "It's the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him." So Eli actually resigned himself to accept the judgment of God. And it's really a sign of maturity on his part that he didn't try to get out of it. He just recognized, hey, okay, this is what God has for me. But this is also a good reminder that even the most amazing men or women of God can disqualify themselves over careless sins. It's so easy to disqualify yourself. I've seen so many pastors over the years disqualified over stupidity, just carelessness, and destroyed themselves, their opportunity, their ability to minister to other people. And so we see that here with Eli. So Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and let none of his words fall to the ground. And all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet. I'm in verse 20 of the Lord. In verse 21, then the Lord appeared again in Shiloh, for the Lord revealed himself to Samuel in Shiloh by the word of the Lord. So the Lord now had a man that he could speak through. He had somebody that had his heart. Was Samuel perfect? Oh, no. Not at all. Samuel was far from perfect. He was flawed, but he was loyal. God's not looking for perfection from you. He knows you can't give it. He knows that we will fall short if perfection is the standard. But what he's looking for is loyalty. As Hananiah said to King Asa in 2 Chronicles 16:9, the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth to show himself strong on behalf of those whose heart is loyal to him. Loyal. That's what God is looking for. God is not silent toward our culture today because he has nothing to say. He is looking for men and women of character that he can say it through. He's looking for people that can be his mouthpiece, people who are loyal to him. The word of the Lord is rare today. There are many going around saying, the word of the Lord, the word of the Lord, and yet the stuff that comes out of their mouth is absolute hogwash. It's not the word of the Lord at all. But God is looking to speak. He has things to say, and he is looking for his mouthpieces. And I believe that he is trying to prepare you to be those mouthpieces. How does God prepare us to be his mouthpieces? He develops our character. Character development. That is the phrase that we use when we describe what God does to grow his people into a place where he can use them. And you may not recognize it as such, because sometimes we see it as trials and tribulations. But in reality, what God is doing is teaching us. James says, my brethren, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Perfect meaning faithful, being loyal, being whole, lacking nothing. That's what God wants for us, that we would have contentment, that we would have everything we need, so that we don't feel like we're missing anything from the world, so that we're complete in him, and he can use that, and he does it through the testing of our faith. A.W. Tozer described character as the excellence of moral beings. The excellence of moral beings. What does that mean? Well, the excellence of gold is purity. The excellence of art is beauty. So the excellence of a moral being is an upright and a godly character. What makes man his best? What makes man outstanding? An upright and a godly character. In his book, Point Man, author Steve Farrar said that reputation is what people think you are. Character is what you are when nobody else is around. And God is looking to develop in us that Christian character. I would define Christian character as that determination to live as a man or a woman before the Lord, no matter what pressure you might face. That's what character is, what Christian character is. That determination to do it God's way, no matter what other people say, no matter what the consequences are, no matter what the threats are, no matter what the price is. Remember this about Samuel. The Lord said he would be a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and my mind. He would have such a relationship with the Lord that no matter what, he would act out on God's will before anybody else's will. Now you say, well, wait a minute, Pastor. That was Samuel. But I could never do that because there are so many things against me. I didn't have the life growing up in the temple. Remember what we said about Samuel. The reason I even covered these first 3 chapters. Samuel grew up in a corrupt society. He grew up in a corrupt church. He was birthed by compromised parents. He was raised by a compromised priest. His peers, Hophni and Phinehas, were corrupt as could be. He had everything against him. And yet, Samuel was a man of God that God could use because he developed a deep character. He stayed true regardless of what anybody else said or did. He chose his friends wisely. He made his decisions wisely. And he didn't go in the direction of the rest of the world because it was contrary to the direction God was going. And if you think, well, I can't do that, well, recognize that you have to do that. Your character is the difference between success and failure as a man or woman of God. Solomon says in Proverbs 11:3, the integrity of the upright will guide them, but the perversity of the unfaithful will destroy them. You know how many lives I've seen in the church of people that, because they wouldn't walk true to the Lord, just messed themselves up, destroyed their families, destroyed their marriages, destroyed their careers over and over again. Because they wouldn't stay true to the Lord, because they wanted to walk in their flesh. They wrecked themselves. Your character is the most important thing you will ever have. Solomon says, Proverbs 22:1, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches. A good name, your character, is more important than anything else in this world. And if you lack it, if you think, well, you know what, Pastor, I've been a pretty rotten person my whole life. I've been running with the wrong crowd and doing the wrong things and saying the wrong things and making the wrong decisions. Is there any hope for me? Yes. Because character is not something you're born with, it's something you develop. Peter said in 2 Peter 1:5, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue. Add to your virtue knowledge. To your knowledge, add self-control. To self-control, perseverance. To perseverance, godliness. To godliness, brotherly kindness. And to brotherly kindness, love. That's a picture of growth, of character development. You've got faith. Now start walking in it. And say, okay, I've got faith. Now I'm going to start doing the right thing because of my faith. And then as I'm walking and doing the right thing because of my faith, I'm going to start exercising, I'm going to start understanding God's heart better. And then as I understand God's heart better, I'm going to start practicing self-control and discipline myself to quit doing stupid things when nobody's around. And then I'm going to add to that perseverance. I'm going to endure all the temptation and trial that comes my way and refuse to give into it. Refuse to cave. As you do that, then you'll start to grow in godliness. And then as you grow in godliness, you'll start to be compassionate upon others who don't walk in godliness. And you'll show brotherly kindness. And then you'll start to show love to the world around you, not self-righteousness. Are your siblings bad examples? Did you grow up in a community that accepted compromise as just the way life is? Where a society where dishonesty was just part of life? Well, you're in good company. You're in the Samuel Club. Choose to grow in your character. Guard it with all your heart. Determine in your heart to do things God's way. And watch what he can do with that person who is faithful to him.